Mr. President, last year was the hottest year on record. 16 of the last 17 years have been the warmest years ever recorded. Climate change science is some of the most thoroughly established and well-tested research in history. And 97% of the published research says climate change is real and caused by humans. Climate change is an urgent threat to our health, our national security, and our economy. How we address it is what we need to debate, not whether it is real. And as I have said before, I will work with anyone in this chamber, Republican or Democrat, to address this issue, and that's appropriate, because survey after survey of people in Colorado, a state that's a third Democratic, a third Republican, and a third independent, demonstrates that they believe the science, no matter which party they belong to. And in a very welcome sign, just last week, a group of statesmen, including former Secretary of State James Baker III, former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of Treasury Henry Paulson Jr., all Republicans, released what they described as a conservative climate solution. These distinguished leaders have come together at just the right moment, at the perfect moment, because our new president says that he's, quote, not a big believer in climate change. In fact, he claimed during the campaign that climate change was a hoax invented by the Chinese to make United States manufacturing non-competitive. Consistent with that view, the president's nominee to run the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, recently said that the debate over climate change is, quote, far from settled. He wondered in December whether global warming is, quote, true or not, whether it's caused by humans, and whether the earth is cooling instead of heating. As Attorney General of Oklahoma, he sought to prevent the very agency he has been nominated to lead from fighting climate change, suing the EPA 14 times. It's important, I guess, to note that while it's rare for somebody in America to share these views, Attorney General Pruitt is not alone in his extreme views in the new president's cabinet. Rick Perry, the nominee to be Secretary of Energy, wrote in his book that climate science is, quote, all one contrived phony mess, and that the earth is actually, quote, experiencing a cooling trend. Ben Carson, nominated to run the Department of Housing and Urban Development, said it's unclear if, quote, temperatures are going up or going down. Rex Tillerson, the new Secretary of State, said none of the models agree on how climate change works. Mr. Trump's CIA director, Mike Pompeo, said there are scientists who think lots of different things about climate change. When the Pope was talking about the importance of addressing climate change, which he said was a very real threat, there was an American politician who said the Pope should stick to religion and that he wasn't a scientist. In fact, the Pope is a chemist. He is a scientist. I'm glad he's using his voice on this important issue. And to be clear, is what I was saying earlier about the nominees, some nominees seem to have undergone a confirmation process evolution on climate. But this seems more an effort to hide their extreme views in an effort to be confirmed rather than a genuine conversion based on facts or science, and that's a shame, because the world cannot wait for this administration to stop ignoring the science. Over the past 150 years, human activity has driven up greenhouse gas levels in our atmosphere higher and faster than at any time over the last 400,000 years. That's not surprising because we've pumped almost 400 billion metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Carbon dioxide concentrations as a result have risen from 280 parts per million to 400 parts per million for the first time in recorded history. That significant change over an insignificant period of time is dramatically changing the Earth. These emissions act like closed car windows. They allow light and heat in, but they don't allow most of the heat to ever escape. Already, record heating has melted ice sheets as large as Texas, Georgia, and New York combined, adding billions of tons of water to our oceans every year. These rising seas have partially submerged cities in Florida and Georgia several times a year. They threaten 31 towns and cities in Alaska with imminent destruction. They're forcing a city in Louisiana to relocate its residents away from what is now an almost permanently flooded coast. By 2030, there won't be any glaciers left in Montana's Glacier National Park. And while extreme events and natural disasters become more frequent, so do the effects climate change has on our daily lives. In my home state, 7 out of 10 Coloradans know that climate change is happening. Nearly half say they have personally experienced its effects. Shorter winters already threaten Colorado's $4.8 billion ski and snowboard industry and its 46,000 jobs. Since the snow is melting sooner, there's not enough water for what are now longer summers. Colorado's farmers are forced to grow food with less water, a changing growing season, and higher temperatures. Our agriculture industry employs over 170,000 Coloradans and contributes more than $40 billion a year to our economy. These changes are not only threatening farmers' livelihoods, but changing production and food prices at grocery stores. Our beer industry is even weighing in. This week, I received a letter from 32 brewers from around the country, including 3 from Colorado, who oppose Scott Pruitt's nomination because they depend on America's clean water resources to brew their beer. Hotter summers and the droughts they prolong cause wildfires that now burn twice as much land every year than they did 40 years ago. Together, state and federal agencies are paying nearly $4 billion a year to fight those fires. Warmer waters and drought are hurting animals everywhere, like our cutthroat trout populations in Colorado. And that's not just a problem for the fish, Mr. President. In Colorado, rivers generate more than $9 billion of economic activity every year, including supporting nearly 80,000 jobs. As warmer temperatures increase and spread across regions, so do incidents of vector-borne diseases like West Nile virus and hantavirus. And what do when we have longer, hotter summers? We crank up the air conditioning, burning more fossil fuel and only perpetuating the problem. I understand that sometimes it's hard to focus on climate change when the effects seem distant. But it should be impossible to ignore the immediate national security threat posed by climate change. That's here today. Here in the Senate in 2015, we passed a budget amendment with bipartisan support to support national security by addressing human-induced climate change. That's what the amendment said. It got bipartisan support. The former Secretary of Defense, the former Director of National Intelligence, former Admiral in charge of U.S. naval forces in the Pacific have all warned us that climate change is a threat to our national security. Around the world, climate change is increasing natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources like food and water, complicating American involvement and security. Climate change is linked to drought and crop loss and failure in southern Africa, leaving more than 6 million children malnourished by famine. It's increasing monsoons and heat waves in Pakistan, driving 11 million people out of their homes. It's even connected to water and food shortages that have intensified civil unrest from Egypt to Syria. At home, climate change already has cost us billions to relocate and buffer military infrastructure from coastal erosion and protect military installations from energy outages. As at the U.S. Atlantic Fleet in Norfolk, Virginia, the largest naval installation in the world, sea levels have risen over a foot in the past 100 years. All the systems that support military readiness, from electrical utilities to housing, at that base are vulnerable to extreme flooding. When the Department of Defense recognizes the reality of climate change, that's their words, and the significant risk it poses to U.S. interests globally, that's their words, we should listen. When the nation's most recent national security strategy says, quote, climate change is an urgent and growing threat, we should act. As a senator from Colorado, I understand very well why people sometimes are frustrated when the EPA, for instance, does not take action, or sometimes when it does take action. There are certainly some regulations that don't make sense, where a well-intentioned idea, or maybe an ill-intentioned idea, I think they're usually well-intentioned, from Washington ends up not making sense when it hits the ground. And that's why I fought to revise EPA fuel storage tank regulations that hurt farmers and ranchers and businesses in my home state without much purpose. I supported an amendment making the agency take another look at a new regulation that burdens families trying to remodel older homes. There are other regulations that I've voted to get rid of. I supported, for instance, lifting the export ban on crude oil from the United States of America, a deal that we passed last year in connection with a 5-year extension of the tax credits for wind and solar energy, a great deal for the state of Colorado, both the lifting of the crude oil ban export and the extension of the tax credits for wind and solar. And I've also supported and fought for our coal communities. In Colorado, working with my colleague, Senator Gardner, I fought to keep the Colawire mine open to protect good-paying jobs in my state. I'm proud to have a hard hat in my office bearing the signatures of the people who work at that mine. But, Mr. President, I have to say tonight that the often asserted claim that efforts to regulate carbon, or more generally to protect our water and our air, have significantly led to job losses in this country is false. This argument is a fraud perpetrated by politicians making promises that are broken from the start. The reality, and it's important to understand the reality so we can remedy the situation. The reality is that free market forces, and not mostly federal regulations, are transforming American electricity production. American coal employment peaked in the early 1980s, long before we began seriously expanding renewable energy. And natural gas has been gaining market share compared to coal since before 1990. Colorado, for example, has benefited greatly from this natural gas boom. In almost every part of the United States, natural gas plants are now cheaper to build than coal plants. Facilities that were built when I became a senator 8 years ago were built to import natural gas, are now being retrofitted to export natural gas to the rest of the world. That's good for our environment, and it's good for the geopolitical position of the United States. And innovation is making renewable electricity more affordable for everybody. Between 2008 and 2015, the cost of wind power fell 41%. The cost of large-scale solar installations fell 64%. This has led to a 95% increase in solar deployment in 2016 alone over 2015. The annual installation doubled in 1 year. If we truly want to support our rural communities, we should listen to Teddy Roosevelt, who once said that conservation and rural life policies are really two sides of the same policy. And down at the bottom, this policy rests upon the fundamental law that neither man nor nation can prosper unless, in dealing with the present, thought is steadily given to the future. And the truth about the future is that there may be a lot of sound reasons to review, revisit, and even retire any number of federal regulations, and I'll bet there are. But cutting regulations will not reopen shuttered coal mines. It's not about regulations or the EPA or about a war on coal. Economic factors, market factors are driving the shift from coal to natural gas and renewables. And we need to recognize this shift. We need to work to help coal communities adapt to a changing energy economy. They have contributed to building the economic vitality of this country. Their work helped us win World War II. We have to recognize the contribution. We can't just turn our back on it. But we also need to acknowledge what's causing the changes that are occurring in our energy production. Because if we can't acknowledge the causes, we can't fix the problem. We can't make a meaningful difference for people in the communities that are affected by these changes. We can't fulfill what have become empty political promises. Instead, make them real commitments on behalf of the American people. And we have to take advantage of the changes in energy production to fuel economic growth and create new jobs. Already, renewable energy is creating jobs around the country. Energy efficiency employs 2.2 million Americans. Solar and wind companies employ more than 360,000 Americans, including more than 13,000 in my home state of Colorado. Colorado now ranks first in the country in wind energy manufacturing. Altogether, clean energy employment grew 29% between 2009 and 2014 in Colorado. This isn't a Bolshevik plot, as I've said on the floor before. These are American jobs. These are manufacturing jobs. These are plants where it's not just about the wind turbine, but all the supply chain that goes along with it, that can't be made in China and shipped to the United States and installed here. These jobs in this supply chain are American jobs, and they're good jobs that pay a good wage, and it's meaningful to our economy. Last year, solar jobs grew 17 times faster than jobs in the rest of the national economy. They increased by 20% in Colorado in 1 year. The expansion of natural gas, as I mentioned earlier, is also aiding our transition to a cleaner energy economy. Between 2005 and 2012, natural gas production grew by 35% in the United States. In Colorado, it expanded by 139%. Colorado now ranks 6th in the country in natural gas production. 10 of the nation's 100 largest natural gas fields are now located in Colorado. These industries together create good-paying jobs that can't be exported overseas. And all of these changes taken together are beginning to address climate change. From 2008 to 2015, The American energy sector reduced its carbon emissions by 9.5%. We reduced our carbon emissions by almost 10%, while the country's economy grew by more than 10%. And we're starting to see the same trend around the world. Global emissions stayed flat in 2015, while the global economy grew. Turning our back on reality is not a recipe for job creation in this country. Embracing the reality is. And so I would ask this new president, after the campaign he ran and the promises he made, why he would promote policies that will kill American jobs and industries. And unfortunately, I regret to say this, Mr. President, even though 70% of Coloradans say that climate change is real and that humankind is contributing to it, the answer to my question about this administration's policies comes back to what it believes, is a debate on climate change. Mr. President, if we allow science to become debatable, we can contort our thinking to fit any action at all, to support or undermine any public policy. We risk discarding facts we don't like and ignoring experts with whom we don't agree in favor of special interests who often dominate our political system. Our country needs more from us than that. Our national defense demands more than that from us. When State Department analysts concluded when State Department analysts concluded that the evidence was science, that the Keystone Pipeline would not materially increase carbon emissions, facts lost in the phony debate here in Washington, I voted for it against intense opposition from my own party and many of my strongest supporters. That was a painful vote, one of the most painful I have ever taken, and difficult to explain to many people I admire. But I was guided by the facts, not by politics. Guided by the science, not by politics. And we've always drawn strength as a country from our belief in science, our confidence in reason and evidence. It's what Harry Truman called our unflinching passion for knowledge and truth. In school, we teach children to support theories with facts and look to science to explore the world. When it comes to climate change, we cannot allow the narrow limits of political expediency and special interests to cloud our sound judgment. That is not a lesson we should be teaching our children who need us to act on climate. That would set a horrible example for the people that are coming after us. Our ultimate success in addressing climate change will rely on the same scientific method that sent us to the moon and eradicated smallpox. If we surrender evidence to ideology when it comes to climate change, we abandon the process of scientific inquiry. We leave ourselves completely unequipped to defend what we discover to be true. We loosen our grip on the science that allows us to understand that evolution is real, that vaccines are effective, that something is true and that something else is false. That, not doubt and denial, is the lesson we should leave our children. That we have the courage to confront this challenge without bias. That we have the wisdom to follow facts wherever they lead. That's what this Senate should do. That's what our country should do. We have seen the evidence now. It is not theoretical anymore that we can grow our economy. In fact, that we will grow our economy. That we can conserve energy while we do it. That we can create entirely new industries and technologies to power the most significant economy that human beings have ever seen in the history of the world, and that we can deal with climate at the same time. The two are linked. That's not what apparently this president believes. That is not what his nominee to be administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency believes. And because that's so far out of step with what Colorado believes, and for all the reasons I've talked about today, and for the sake of our climate, and for good-paying American jobs all over this country, but particularly in Colorado, I am compelled to vote no on the president's nominee to head the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. President, I yield the floor.